The brain is basically an organic computer, but it's more versatile than any computer that we know of. The brain is far more complex than the spinal cord. Spinal cord just handles simple reflexes. The brain is actually what thought processes. The brain consists of roughly 20 billion neurons. And each of those neurons, they all have a function. Okay. Embryology of the brain, how the brain develops. The central nervous system begins as a neural tube. The middle of the tube, the lumen, okay, is filled with fluid. Okay, the lumen of the tube will expand, forming the various ventricles of the brain. That fluid is cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, when that lumen starts to develop, it forms the 4 ventricles of the brain. In the 4th week of development, the cephalic area of the neural tube enlarges to form 3 sections: the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. The forebrain, the midbrain, and the rear brain. Okay, so that's at 4 weeks old. Not 4 weeks old, but at 4 weeks after conception. Okay, you have the prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. It's already developed. Those 3 areas of the brain have already developed. Okay, so here's your prosencephalon, front part of the brain, mesencephalon, middle, and rhombencephalon is the rear part. Okay. The prosencephalon forms the telencephalon, which forms your cerebrum, where all your thought processes occur, and the diencephalon. So the prosencephalon forms the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The telencephalon is your cerebrum. The diencephalon is your epithalamus, your thalamus, and your hypothalamus. Okay? So this controls where all your thought processes occur, and these relays bring all the information from the body into the cerebrum. So this is what gathers information and then sends it to the cerebrum. This is your prosencephalon, telencephalon, diencephalon. Okay. So here, the prosencephalon splits into the telencephalon and the diencephalon. Your cerebral cortex, your epithalamus, your thalamus, and your hypothalamus. The mesencephalon. The mesencephalon does not divide. It just keeps as one area, and that is your midbrain. So the mesencephalon stays as the midbrain, does not divide. Okay? Mesencephalon is your midbrain. Okay? The rhombencephalon. The rhombencephalon divides. It forms a metencephalon, okay, which forms your pons and your cerebellum. And I told you the cerebellum is like a second brain behind the cerebral cortex. Okay? And the pons is directly in front of the cerebellum. And it forms the myelencephalon, which forms the medulla oblongata. So those 2 areas form the rhombencephalon, goes into metencephalon and the myelencephalon. The metencephalon forms the pons and cerebellum. The myelencephalon forms the medulla oblongata. Okay, so here's your rhombencephalon, forms a metencephalon, myelencephalon, cerebellum and pons, medulla oblongata. Okay, major regions of the brain. Okay, ones you need to know: medulla oblongata, the pons, which are right across from the cerebellum, mesencephalon, which does not divide, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum, which is from the telencephalon. Okay. Again, this is going to break down the different pictures we'll be going over, but this is the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is where your conscious thought, your intellectual functions occur. Okay. Memory storage and processing, conscious and subconscious regulation of skeletal muscle contractions. Okay. So if you're sitting here listening to my lecture and you're getting sleepy and your head falls to the side and bangs on your desk, okay, that's your subconscious regulation. Bring those skeletal muscles contract to bring it right back up again. You ever start falling asleep and your head jerks forward? That's your cerebrum. That's working out that. That's a conscious and subconscious regulation of skeletal muscle contractions. Okay? And the cerebrum comes from the telencephalon. Okay? The diencephalon, which is the other division of the telencephalon, forms your thalamus, your hypothalamus, and your epithalamus. The thalamus is a relay processing center for sensory information. Most of the sensory information coming into the brain enters the thalamus and then gets distributed to the correct portions of the brain from there. The hypothalamus is your center for controlling emotions, your autonomic function, and your hormone production is your hypothalamus. Okay? All that comes from the telencephalon, these two areas. This is your telencephalon right here. Your midbrain. Midbrain is a mesencephalon. That does not divide, remember? That just forms the midbrain. And the mesencephalon is the processing of visual and auditory data. What are the two things in the midbrain that control the visual and auditory data? What relay does auditory information go into in the midbrain? Remember, there are two structures. There are actually four bumps, two on the right, two on the left. And it's just in front of the cerebellum, and it's just behind the thalamus. Okay. The auditory one is the inferior colliculi. The visual one is the what?
Posterior.
Superior. Superior colliculi. You got a superior colliculi, which is visual, inferior colliculi, which is auditory. Okay, that's part of the midbrain. Okay, those are responses to visual and auditory data. Okay, the midbrain also generates reflexes, somatic motor control, and maintains consciousness. Okay, so that's the part of the brain that is affected when you're in a coma. That's the part that maintains your conscious awareness. Okay, and then the rhombencephalon. Okay, forms of medulla oblongata and the pons. The pons is a relay center for the cerebellum and the thalamus, and subconscious and visceral motor centers. The medulla oblongata relays information to the thalamus, other parts of the brainstem. All the information coming through the spinal cord passes through the medulla oblongata. It regulates visceral functions like cardiovascular function, your heart rate, respiratory function, digestive functions, and so on, are regulated by the medulla oblongata. And the cerebellum here, this controls your coordinated movements of your output from the cerebral cortex. All right. So if you look at a cross section of the brain, this is your frontal lobe. This is where all the thinking occurs. Okay. Mesencephalon. This is the midbrain. Okay. You've got your pons, which is your swelling right here that sits just in front of the cerebellum. There's your cerebellum, and right directly across from that is your pons. And the medulla oblongata extends into the brainstem. Okay. And we found our thalamus. Our thalamus is an egg-shaped structure, which contains all the relay information right in there. And just below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. That's this area right here. And just above it is the epithalamus. You see that membrane right there. Okay. Those are part of the structures of the brain that you'd be responsible for knowing. So these are, again, major regions and landmarks. The medulla oblongata, okay, relays information to the thalamus and the brainstem. So it passes through the medulla oblongata on its way to the thalamus and your brainstem. The medulla oblongata regulates your heart rate, regulates your blood pressure, and regulates digestive function. The pons relays information to the cerebellum and to the thalamus. Okay? Because remember, the cerebellum has to know where things are, right? The cerebellum is constantly monitoring where everything is in your body. So from the pons, it goes to the cerebellum. So that way, when the cerebral cortex decides on something, it goes back to the cerebellum and it goes, I know where things are. I know where I have to move to make this a smooth movement. So the pons reads information from the cerebellum and the thalamus, and it regulates somatic and visceral motor controls. Okay, so here's what we're talking about. We're talking about the pons. And here's where it's located. It's this swelling right here in front of the cerebellum. Okay. So the pons relay sensory information to the cerebellum and thalamus, and subconscious and somatic and visceral motor control. Medulla oblongata relays sensory information to the thalamus and other parts of the brain stem as autonomic centers, okay, for the function of your cardiovascular, your heart rate, your respiratory, the number of breaths that you take, okay, and your digestive system, there's activity, how when you're digesting food, what's causing peristalsis, things like that. Mesencephalon. Remember, the mesencephalon is the one that does not divide. That's the midbrain. It maintains consciousness and alertness. Okay? So your midbrain is what is affected when you have a coma situation. Okay? That's what maintains consciousness in your human body, is the mesencephalon. It's involved with reflex somatic motor responses to stimulus. Okay? That's how your body responds to stimuli. And here's the mesencephalon. This is the mid part of the brain right here. Okay. Processes of visual and auditory data, generation of reflexive somatic motor responses, and maintains consciousness and alertness. Okay. And in the mid mesencephalon, in the midbrain, the visual input that your mind sees is through the superior colliculi. The auditory, that's what I can spell right. Auditory is through the inferior colliculi. Okay, and those are the bumps just right between the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex. When you pull that open, you'll see those. And we'll show you a picture of one in just a second here. So we see right where it's at. So major landmarks are the diencephalon. Remember, that's part of the telencephalon, breaks into the diencephalon. You got your epithalamus, which is on top, the thalamus, which is your egg-shaped relay center, and your hypothalamus, which is below the thalamus. Okay. The epithalamus contains the pineal gland. The pineal gland generates or produces melatonin. The pineal gland controls your circadian rhythm. Let you know when it's nighttime, when it's daytime, when you're supposed to be awake, when you're supposed to sleep. Okay? It produces melatonin. Okay? So when you're all messed up and you're working the night shift, that's the culprit. Okay? That's the one telling you should be sleeping and not working the night shift, is your pineal gland. That controls what's called your circadian rhythm. Thalamus relays information to the cerebrum. Most information from the external part of your body, the peripheral nervous system, your environment from your body, comes into the body, into the central nervous system, goes into the thalamus. The thalamus sends it to the cerebrum. Now it sends it to the right place in the cerebrum. You know, information from your arm goes to a different place than information from your leg. So you know where the information is coming from. You know, if your foot's on a hot coal, you know it's not your arm you want to contract. You know it's your foot. It goes to the right part of the brain. That's the thalamus's job, to take all that information in and then send it to all the correct places in the brain, into the cerebrum, so it goes to the right place so the brain can interpret where that stimuli is coming from. And it basically processes sensory information so it knows where to send it to the cerebral cortex so you can decide what you want to do about it. Hypothalamus is your emotions, thirst, and some habitual activities. Sex drives, hunger, things like that. So that's your hypothalamus, your emotions, thirst, and habitual activity. Okay, well, here's your diencephalon. Diencephalon is the epithalamus, which it doesn't say here, but it's the epithalamus, which is your pineal gland. Your thalamus, which relays and processes centers for sensory information. And your hypothalamus, controlling emotions, autonomic functions, and hormone productions through the pituitary gland. You can see that a little bit here too. All right, the cerebellum we talked about a lot. basically have two brains, the cerebellum and the cerebrum. The cerebellum is when it sits behind it, it's a smaller one, and it coordinates somatic motor function. It's responsible for your cool points, as my daughter would say. It makes it easy to remember what it does. It adjusts the output of somatic motor centers that result in smooth operation. So if you have your pencil sitting on your desk and you bring your hand to pick that pencil up, your hand doesn't go like this, and try to find the pencil. Your hand goes from wherever it knows it's at, and it goes directly to that pencil. That's the function of the cerebellum, to coordinate those movements so you pick up that pencil without jerking your hand all around, and you can lift it up and write notes whatever you want to do with it. Okay, you have constant input from the environment into the cerebellum and to the basal nuclei. So they know where your body is at all times. So they know if you want to pick that pencil up and your hand's on your right-hand side, you swing it over to the left side of the pencil over there. You don't have to move it up or down to find out where your hand is. The cerebellum already knows that. The cerebrum, that is branches from the telencephalon. This is your conscious thought process. This is your intellectual functions. This is your memory storage. You have conscious regulation of skeletal muscles contractions. You regulate where all the muscles are contracting so you know what your body's doing. That's where all your intelligence is, all your memory, and all your conscious thought processes. All right. So cerebellum coordinates complex somatic motor patterns, adjusts output of motor centers in the brain and spinal cord. Cerebrum, conscious thought process, intellectual functions, memory storage and processing, retrieving memory is from your cerebrum. Conscious and subconscious regulation of your skeletal muscle contractions, knowing where your body parts are at all times. All right. Any questions so far? You actually covered a lot of material. Gray matter and white matter. We talked about that before. Gray matter is basically the cell bodies, the soma. White matter are the axons. Okay? There's a myelination. You see the white fat layer around the myelin, around the nerve of the neuron. The cerebrum consists of an inner gray matter surrounded by tracts of white matter. Gray matter consists of cell bodies. White matter is your axons, your myelinated axons. You have a ventricle system of the brain. This fluid flows around the brain and provides certain functions of it. Okay? This is ventricles. Ventricles are openings in the brain or cavities. Okay? They're fluid-filled cavities or ventricles. They're filled with cerebral spinal fluid. The fluid transmits nutrients to the central nervous system and transports waste away from the central nervous system. And also provides for cushioning of the central nervous system. It allows the brain not to be slammed against the base of the skull, of the bones of the skull. It allows for a little give there, so you don't damage your brain every time you shake your head. Okay. There's 4 ventricles in the human brain. Okay. There's ventricles 1 and 2, which are called your lateral ventricles. There's ventricle 3 in the diencephalon and ventricle 4 in the cerebellum. Okay. So ventricles 1 and 2 are your lateral ventricles. Okay, one's on the right, one's on the left. Those are your lateral ventricles. They're located in the cerebral hemisphere and they're separated by something called the septum pellucidum that separates the 2 lateral ventricles. Okay. Ventricle 3 is in the diencephalon, down farther. Then ventricle 4 lies in between the pons and the cerebellum. Those are your 4 ventricles are located. Okay, if you look at a cross section again, here's your cerebellum, here's your cerebral cortex right up in here. This is your one lateral ventricle. This is the second ventricle. And they're separated by the septum pellucidum in the center. So those are your lateral ventricles. And there's 2, one on the left, one on the right. And it doesn't matter which one's number 1. I mean, number 1's not the right, number 2's not the left. It's just there's 2 ventricles, 1 and 2. It doesn't matter which one you call it. There's one's on the right, one's on the left. Okay, so there's ventricles 1 and 2. You have the third ventricle, which is in the diencephalon, and then you have your fourth ventricle, which is in the pons cerebrum and the pons. Okay, all those are interconnected. The lateral ventricles connect to the third ventricle, what's called the interventricular foramen. So your lateral ventricles, the fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, flows from the lateral ventricles into your third ventricle through the interventricular foramen. Fluid flows from the cerebrospinal fluid flows from the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle through what's called the aqueduct of the midbrain. This is the aqueduct of the midbrain. So the lateral ventricles flow through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle. The third ventricles flows through the aqueduct of the midbrain into the fourth ventricle. And the fourth ventricle feeds into the central canal going down the spinal cord. That's how fluid flows. Cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the arachnoid matter to fill back up the ventricles, and fluid flows out into the venous system as it gets used up. So it's a constant replenishment of the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, this is a side view. This is your lateral ventricle right here. It has an anterior horn, a posterior horn, and inferior horn. That's the lateral ventricles, 1 and 2. One's on the right, one's on the left. The septum pellucidum is right in between here, separating the lateral ventricles. Okay, the lateral ventricles flow through this duct right here. That's the interventricular foramen. It flows through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle. This is your third ventricle. The third ventricle flows through this little duct right here. It flows through the flows through the aqueduct of the midbrain, and that flows into the fourth ventricle. And you can see your cerebellum, and you see the pons. And right between that, here is your fourth ventricle. Okay, and then from there, it flows into the brainstem, down the spinal cord. All right. So the ventricular system of the brain. You have the lateral ventricles 1 and 2. The main portion lies in the parietal lobes. That's where the main portion of the lateral ventricles lay. Each has an anterior horn that extends into the frontal lobe. Each has a posterior horn that extends into the occipital lobe. Each has an inferior horn which extends into the temporal lobe. So all the lobes of the brain have cerebrospinal fluid around them to help protect them. That's how it's designed. So the lateral ventricle is in the parietal lobes. It extends out anteriorly to the frontal lobe, posteriorly to the occipital lobe, and inferiorly to the temporal lobe to make sure all the brain is protected by or covered with cerebrospinal fluid, because it protects the brain and delivers nutrients to the brain tissue, and it takes away waste from the brain cells. So each lateral ventricle communicates with the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen. Foramen just means opening. So between the ventricles. So the cerebrospinal fluid flows through the interventricular foramen from the lateral ventricles into ventricle number 3. And there's only one ventricle number 3. There's not a right and a left. The third ventricle communicates with the fourth ventricle through the aqueduct of the midbrain. The fourth ventricle communicates to the central canal of the spinal cord. Fluid flows from the fourth ventricle down through the spinal cord, through the central canal. So far, so good. Again, so here's our lateral ventricles. Lateral ventricles 1 and 2. Third ventricle, fourth ventricle. And the lateral ventricles, it flows through there, which is your interventricular foramen, into the third ventricle. From the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle, flows through the aqueduct of the midbrain. Fourth ventricle is through the central canal into the spinal cord. So far, so good.
So the fluid that's in there in the ventricles is what they would pull out whenever they're looking for meningitis.
Yes, that's what you do a spinal tap. That's the fluid you go after from a spinal tap. When you're looking for meningitis, infection that's spread to the brain, because the infection is spread into the cerebrospinal fluid, that's where you'll find it. Exactly right. There's just a different view of it looking at the top part. Again, you see the lateral ventricles. You see this opening right here and right here. Those are your interventricular foramens. This is your third ventricle. This is the aqueduct of the midbrain, connecting it to the fourth ventricle. And the fourth ventricle through the central canal into the spinal cord. Okay, that's the ventricular system in a nutshell, right there. All right. Any questions on any of the ventricles? I guarantee you'll see that on your midterm. Carrie understands it 100% completely. Or will before the midterm, right? All right. We'll go another 10 minutes or so. Protection of the brain. The brain is very important to protect. Without the brain, we cease to function. First protection of the brain is the bones of the skull. We talked about the parietal bone, the frontal bone, occipital bone, temporal bones. You should all know where those are. Those act to protect the skull. It's a hard casing. You also have the cranial meninges. We talked about the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the pia mater, all help to protect the brain. We just got to talk about cerebral spinal fluid. And we talked about the blood-brain barrier. Let certain things into the brain, other things not into the brain. So those four things, the bones of the skull, the cranial meninges, the cerebral spinal fluid, the blood-brain barrier, all act to protect the brain. Okay. The cranial meninges, there's three of them. They surround the brain and the spinal cord. There's three layers of the meninges. There's dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater is the outermost, thicker, tough layer. The arachnoid is the middle layer. The pia mater is the deepest and very thin innermost layer. It's kind of like, you can't really even see it. It's like saran wrap laying over the brain tissues. It's very, very thin layer. So here's a division. This is your dura mater. The dura mater has two layers, an endosteal layer and a meningeal layer. Okay, that's the outer layer of that, and then you have the dural sinus between the two layers. So there's your dura mater. Okay, underneath that is your arachnoid mater. Okay, the arachnoid mater has this space right here. This is your subarachnoid space. That's where the cerebrospinal fluid is. Cerebral spinal fluid is in the subarachnoid space. Okay. Then you got your pia mater underneath that. It's a very, very thin layer. All right. So here's a look at it. This is the skull. This is the bone. This will be part of the parietal bone. Okay. So now you have bone. Then you got dura mater. Then you got arachnoid mater. Then you got your pia mater. It's very difficult to see the pia mater. Like I said, it's very, very thin. Okay. So you have bone, the skull bones. Then you have the dura mater underneath that. Okay. That acts as a protector. It's not as strong as the bone, but it's thicker. It's the thickest layer of the matter that protects the bone, of the brain. I'm sorry. So the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater. We'll start where it says start. What's that pointing to?
The lateral ventricles 1 and 2.
Lateral ventricles 1 and 2. All right. What's the next one down pointing to? What connects the lateral ventricle to the next one?
Interventricular foramen.
Interventricular foramen. Perfect. And then what is that one pointing to?
The third ventricle.
Third ventricle. Got it. Okay. What are these extensions pointing to?
The horns of the lateral ventricles.
Right. Which horns though? Yeah,
Inferior.
Those are the posterior horns. Perfect. Those are the posterior horns of the lateral ventricle. And they innervate what part of the brain? What lobe? Not innervate, but they travel into what lobe of the brain?
Occipital?
Occipital. That's your posterior lobe. Perfect. Okay. And the next ones are the what?
Inferior.
Inferior horns.
Perfect. The horns, the inferior horns of the lateral ventricles. And those travel into what part of the brain?
Midbrain.
Not the midbrain, but the what lobe? I'm sorry, I should have said what lobe. What bone's right there?
Parietal.
Parietal's the top one. That's where the lateral ventricles put fluid into the parietal lobe. What's the lobe below the parietal lobe? Starts with a T. TE.
The temporal lobe.
Very good. There we go. The temporal lobe. That not innervates, but that saturates the temporal lobe. Okay. So all this are the different lobes of the brain. The parietal lobes where the main lateral ventricle sit, then it innervates backwards, posterior to the occipital lobe, and down inferior to the temporal lobe. All right. So what's the next structure pointing to?
Cerebral aqueduct.
Aqueduct of the midbrain, right? And the aqueduct of the midbrain flows into this area right here, which is what?
The fourth.
Fourth ventricle.
Perfect. The fourth ventricle. Okay. And this big structure here is what? The
Cerebellum.
oh, wait, you need the right button. There you go. Fourth ventricle. What's this thing?
The cerebellum.
Cerebellum. Perfect. Okay. And then this right here.
The spinal cord.
And the pons is up higher.
Spinal cord.
Spinal cord, your brainstem. That's your brainstem that feeds into the spinal cord. There's your spinal cord. Okay. And then this is called what?
The central canal.
Central canal. Perfect. And this is
Medulla oblongata.
medulla oblongata. Okay. The top part, most posterior portion of the brainstem. Now, this is what?
Pons.
That's the pons. It's up right at the cerebellum. That's your pons. And what's this extension here called?
Anterior.
Inferior horns of lateral ventricles.
Perfect. Anterior horns of the lateral ventricle. And they saturate what part, what lobe of the brain?
Parietal.
No,
Frontal.
this is
Frontal.
the
Frontal.
frontal, right. That's the frontal part of the brain. And this is your
Cerebral hemisphere.
the cerebral cortex, right? The cerebral hemispheres. Yep. That's the cerebellum. Your cerebral hemispheres, the right and left. Perfect. All right. We're talking more about the cranial meninges. We'll go for another couple minutes and we'll get a little break here. So you have the dura mater, which is the outer layer. The dura mater has two layers. It consists of the endosteal layer and the meningeal layer. The endosteal layer is the outermost layer of the dura mater. That's the one that butts up against the bones of the skull. It's a layer that's felt within the anterior fontanelle of the baby. Remember, the babies don't have the skull bones fused yet. So that soft spot, that first thing you feel is the endosteal layer of the dura mater when you feel a baby's soft spot, because the bones have not developed yet. It's fused to the periosteum lining of the cranial bones. So the endosteal layer of the dura mater fuses to the periosteum, which is a layer of the tissue layer of the scalp bones, of the skull bones. The meningeal layer is the innermost layer of the dura mater. That's the one that's closest to the brain. Okay, that's your meningeal layer. The space between those two layers is called the dural sinus. Okay, so this is the dural sinus. The space between them. This is the cranium. This is your skull bones right here. And this is the endosteal layer, the layer that's adjacent to or touching up against the skull bones. Okay, and then you got your meningeal layer, which is a layer that comes up into the arachnoid matter. closer towards the brain. There's 4 folds of the dura mater that help divide the brain. And this is from the meningeal layer. So the meningeal layer forms 4 folds: the falx cerebri, the tentorium cerebelli, the falx cerebelli, and the diaphragma cilia. Okay. Those 4 layers form. And the falx cerebri, okay, is a meningeal layer that extends into the longitudinal fissure. That's the big fissure between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. That's your longitudinal fissure. And this goes in between there to help divide and protect those. It has an inferior anterior portion that attaches to the cristogalea of the sphenoid bone, and an inferior portion that attaches to the internal occipital crest of the tentorium cerebelli. Okay. So these are just divisions that come down between the brain into sections to help protect it. And you show how so easy to connect in a picture here. Then you have the tentorium cerebelli, which separates the cerebral hemispheres from the cerebellar hemispheres. So between the 2 brains, there's a layer of dura mater that dives in between them to help separate those. And that's called the tentorium cerebelli. Extends across the cranium at right angles to the falx cerebri. Okay. The falx cerebri extends from the tentorium cerebri to separate the cerebral hemispheres. So that's just the falx cerebelli separates the cerebellar hemispheres to the right and left. And the diaphragma cilia lines the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, and that's what encases the pituitary gland. That protects and surrounds the pituitary gland. So it anchors the dura mater to the sphenoid bone that forms the sella turcica that goes around the pituitary. Okay, we're talking about the different meningeal layers and the divisions of the dura mater of the meningeal layer dividing down in between the cerebellum, in between the cerebrum, then in between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. So this is a falx cerebri. This goes between the cerebral cortex, the right and left hemispheres of the brain. Okay, it's part of the dura mater. Remember, you got the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater in that order, protecting the brain. So this is the meningeal part of the dura mater, comes down and dies in between the cerebral cortex. And that's your falx cerebri. Okay. So this is the falx cerebri, looking at the side view of it here. Then 90 degrees to that, you have the tentorium cerebri, which separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Okay. Then you got the falx cerebelli, which separates the 2 halves of the cerebellum, right and left sides. Then you got the diaphragma cilia, which separates around the pituitary gland. The sella turcica is a bone structure right around that one, of the sphenoid bone. Okay. So those are your different protective layers, the 4 layers of the meningeal portion of the dura mater. Okay, the arachnoid mater consists of projections called arachnoid granulations. The cerebral spinal fluid flows through these to enter into the venous system. In other words, so the cerebral spinal fluid, you can't build too much pressure in your spinal cord. So that you produce cerebral spinal fluid, you got to be able to get rid of it too. And it flows through these arachnoid granulations into the venous circulation. It consists of web-like material that underlines the arachnoid layer. The collagenous fibers anchor the cerebral blood vessels in place, okay, that surround the brain. So again, here's your arachnoid mater. And this is a subarachnoid space, the space below the arachnoid mater. That's where the cerebral spinal fluid flows through. You can see all these different trabeculation patterns here. That's going to hold all the blood vessels in place. Okay. There you can see an example of it. This is the arachnoid mater here. This is a subarachnoid space, and all these little collagenous fibers form what's called a trabeculation, and they hold the arteries and veins in place in that area. So these are your arachnoid granulations, and the cerebrospinal fluid can flow through those back into the venous system. The pia mater. We talked about the dura mater, the arachnoid matter. Now we got the pia mater. The pia mater is just this thin little film. You can't even see it. It goes over the brain. It's attached to directly attached to the surface of the brain. It follows the sulci, which are the grooves of the brain, and the gyri, which are the bumps in the brain. Okay? It helps to anchor larger blood vessels of the cerebrum close to the brain. And again, here's your cerebral vein, and this is the pia mater right here. This thin layer here that lines on the cerebral cortex. So your subdural space below the dura mater, your subarachnoid space below the arachnoid mater. This is the cerebral cortex. This is the cerebral vein. This is a trabeculation pattern in the subarachnoid space that holds the veins in place. And the perivascular space where these veins can dive down in between the cerebral cortex and supply blood to the brain, where nutrients can get to the neurons and waste can be taken away from the neurons. All right. Traumatic brain injuries. That's what the cerebral is supposed to prevent. Okay. Traumatic brain injury result from harsh contact between the head and another object or from a severe jolt. The head is moving. The head stops all of a sudden. The brain keeps moving, slams against the sides of the skull. That's a concussion or a traumatic brain injury. It accounts for more than half the deaths associated with trauma. Is traumatic brain injuries. There's 1.5 million cases in the United States every year. Of those 1.5 million cases, 50,000 are deaths, 80,000 are long-term disabilities. Concussions are a form of traumatic brain injury, can accompany even a minor head injury. Severe concussions are usually associated with contusions, which are bruising of the brain. If the brain slams hard enough against the skull, it's going to bleed. Those are contusions. Hemorrhages, bleeding the brain, and lacerations of brain tissue actually cut through the brain tissue if the bones in the skull and the dura mater are damaged. Damage to the reticular formation can result in a permanent state of unconsciousness. That's your midbrain. Okay. Damage to the lower brainstem usually proves fatal. You damage the medulla oblongata, you damage the brainstem down low, it's usually almost always going to be fatal. Okay, because all the information from your spinal cord travels through that into the brain. This is a difference between an epidural hematoma and a subdural hematoma. Okay, an epidural hematoma is everything is pushed onto the brain, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. So the skull fractures, you actually have a break in the bone. Okay, this is the skull bone right here. Okay, these are the arteries, the artery breaks and the artery starts to bleed. And this blood, this is the dura mater that gets pushed down. So the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater all get compressed against the vein. This one is extremely dangerous because it's an arterial bleed. Arterial bleeds means blood's being pumped at a forceful rate, and it's going to occur rapidly. Without emergency treatment, extremely soon, that patient is going to die. You're going to compress the brain. Okay, so an epidural hematoma is all three layers of meninges get compressed into the brain from a skull fracture. Subdural hematoma is when there's not a skull fracture. That's a venous bleed. Okay? Venous blood doesn't pump. Venous blood is returned. Okay? So the pressure is all left. It's not going to bleed as quickly. The dura mater stays intact. Okay. It's a subdural. It's below the dura. It's above the arachnoid. It's between the dura mater and the arachnoid layer. So you break the venous blood, and it bleeds into the brain from either the brain being shoved against the skull, damage to the venous, the vein. Okay. So the dura mater stays intact. That's this green layer right here. The arachnoid mater, and the pia mater get compressed into the brain. That's a lot slower. It still can be life-threatening, but you have more time to work with that one. Okay. So when you're in an emergency room, you have to understand the difference. There's the vast difference in treatment. The epidural hematoma requires immediate treatment. You don't have time to waste. The skull's fractured, you have an arterial bleed, and the dura mater, which is a hard material, is being pushed into the brain. Dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. Okay. A subdural hematoma, the dura stays intact. The brain slams against the side of the skull. A vein is broken. The vein starts to bleed. The veins are in the subdural space below the dura mater. So the arachnoid matter and the pia mater get compressed onto the brain. Okay? And that takes a lot longer time because it's a slower bleed. This is what they look like. Okay? This is an epidural hematoma. You see, this is your dura mater, this dark layer here, and that's compressed onto the brain. And this is an arterial bleed. This is a venous bleed here. Okay? It's a lot slower. The dura mater is still up here. The arachnoid matter and the pia mater are still compressing into the brain. And again, they both can be fatal. They both can cause problems. But the epidural hematoma is going to be a lot faster because it's an arterial bleed. The subdural hematoma is going to be a lot slower because it's a venous bleed. So those are the x-rays you can see in the emergency room when you get your pictures back. And you can tell which type it is just by looking at the x-ray. What's wrong? Wrong computer. All right. How about the blood-brain barrier? You talked a little bit about that before we did that rat experiment. We talked about that. So the lining of the blood vessel consists of endothelial cells that are interconnected by tight junctions. Okay, you know what endothelial cells are? You know what tight junctions are. Because of this tight junction, only lipid-soluble material can pass from the blood to the cells of the brain and spinal cord. Water-soluble materials can only pass through actions of transport mechanisms. So that means it's very specific. You have to have a transport mechanism in place. You have to have a receptor that bonds to a specific shape of that molecule and allows it to pass through the phospholipid bilayer, the membrane. Okay, so only things that are lipid soluble, and only things that have specific receivers or receptors for them can pass through the blood-brain barrier and get to the central nervous system and the spinal cord. That was like the difference we talked about between morphine and heroin. Okay, heroin has no effect on the brain. Okay, but heroin's converted to morphine. Heroin acts faster because heroin's lipid soluble, whereas morphine is not as lipid soluble. So heroin passes the blood-brain barrier extremely quickly. Once it's in the brain, it converts to morphine, and then it has its effect. It bonds to the morphine receptors, the endorphin receptors. So heroin's a lot more addictive than morphine because it passes the blood-brain barrier at a very quick rate. Blood-brain barrier is intact in the central nervous system, except in three areas. There's three areas where there's leakage in the blood-brain barrier. There's a portion of the hypothalamus, portion of the pineal gland, and on the roof of the third and fourth ventricle. Those areas you can leak from, you have openings in the blood-brain barrier. The cerebrospinal fluid prevents contact of neural tissues with the surrounding bone. It provides a pool of water, pool of fluid around the brain tissue, all these nerves, so it doesn't get slammed into the bone when the brain shakes, the brain moves. It also provides support, transports nutrients to the central nervous system tissue, and transports waste away from the central nervous system. Okay, cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is made by epidermal cells of what's called the choroid plexus. So these epidermal cells produce cerebrospinal fluid, and they're part of the choroid plexus. They actively transport nutrients, vitamins, and other ions into the central nervous system. They actively remove waste from the central nervous system. So they provide nutrients and remove waste. Okay. This is the choroid plexus right here. Okay. These epidermal cells that line it produce cerebrospinal fluid. Again, they bring nutrients into the cell. They get waste back into the bloodstream, away from the central nervous system. So circulation of the central cerebrospinal fluid. It flows from the choroid plexus. That's where it's made. The epidermal cells of the choroid plexus make cerebrospinal fluid, and it goes into the lateral ventricles. Flows through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle. Flows through the aqueduct to the midbrain into the fourth ventricle. Then it goes from the lateral aperture and median apertures. It flows through the subarachnoid space, and a small amount goes in the central canal down the spinal cord. And then it goes to the arachnoid granulations where it flows into the venous system and out. Okay. So it's a continuous flow of producing more cerebrospinal fluid and getting rid of cerebrospinal fluid back into the venous system. So again, here's your granulations, which kick the cerebrospinal fluid out back into the venous system. This is the choroid plexus that produces cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so this is what your granulations look like enlarged, and this is a subarachnoid space below it where the cerebrospinal fluid flows. So this is your cerebrospinal fluid being produced in the lateral ventricles, goes to the ventricular foramen, goes in the third ventricle, aqueduct of the midbrain into the fourth ventricle, and then down the central canal through the spinal cord. Okay. And it's excreted from the lateral apertures and the median apertures back into the venous system. And that's how it flows. That's cerebrospinal fluid 101. All right, the medulla oblongata is continuous with the spinal column to the brain stem. So the medulla oblongata connects the spinal cord, okay, to the brain stem. Has to flow through there. Okay, here. All communication with the brain between the brain and spinal cord pass through the medulla oblongata. Nuclei in the medulla oblongata are relay stations for sensory or motor pathways. It's associated with cranial nerves, connected to the medulla oblongata, and they're associated with autonomic control of visceral organs. So basically everything runs through the medulla oblongata, both sensory and motor. The relay stations. Okay? Relay stations are the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. Those are two relay stations in the medulla oblongata. They pass somatic sensory information to the thalamus. So those are responsible for sensory information going to the thalamus, the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. The olivary nuclei pass information from the cerebrum, spinal cord, diencephalon, and brainstem to the cerebellum. Okay, they pass information from your cerebrum, when you think about spinal cord, into the cerebellum, so it can vote on it and determine where that information has to smooth out those muscles, so everything can act as a smooth, coordinated effort. Okay. So this is a medulla oblongata coming up in the brainstem. This is the nucleus gracilis, both right and left sides. This is the nucleus cuneatus, and this is the olivary nuclei. Okay. Nuclei of the cranial nerves. They contain sensory and motor nuclei of cranial nerves, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Okay, we'll get into the cranial nerves in just a second. There's 12 cranial nerves. I'll go over each one of those. The autonomic nuclei are your major reflex centers. They include your cardiovascular centers for your cardiac heartbeat and monitoring of that, and your respiratory centers for your rhythmic breathing. So you have reflex centers in the medulla oblongata that control your heart rate, will speed it up or slow it down, and your respiratory rate will provide a certain rhythmic breathing for you. So here's the cardiovascular centers. It's right here. That's your cardiovascular centers, and this is your respiratory center. Right medial to the olivary nuclei, which is right here. Okay, the other nuclei centers are down below that. This is your nuclei gracilis still, and your nuclei cuneatus. Okay, so that's the medulla oblongata. Now the pons. The pons is that big bulge that's just in front of the cerebellum, the cerebellar cortex. What's in front of that is the pons. The pons is sensory and motor nuclei for cranial nerves, 5, 6, 7, and 8. They run through that. The nuclei involved in control of breathing consists of an apneuistic center and a pneumotaxic center. Apneuistic increases your breathing rate, causing you to have a deeper, harder breath, but increase how deep you breathe. And pneumotaxic centers decrease how deep you breathe, how much air you're taking in. So it prevents overexpansion of your lungs. Okay? You got to remember, there's always going to be two systems. If one increases, one has to be able to decrease it. You have to be able to monitor it. So if you need more air, you're going to breathe deeper. That's your apneuistic center. Okay? If you have too much air already, your lungs getting full, expanding, you're going to shrink that down. That's your pneumotactic center. That shuts that down. So apneuistic increases the depth of your breathing. Pneumotactic center decrease the depth of your breathing. Okay? There's nuclei that relays cerebellar commands. It consists of your cerebellar peduncles, which is a tract, basically connects the cerebellum to the brainstem. Those are your cerebellar peduncles. Those are tracts of neurons that run through there. There's ascending, descending, and transverse tracts. Ascending is afferent information going to the cerebrum. Descending is efferent information going to the muscles, glandular control, things like that. Transverse tracts are ones that are desiccated, going from one side to the other and then going up. All right, so you have descending tracts, like we said, and you have ascending tracts. Okay, descending tracts are going down for muscle control, motor neurons, and ascending are sensory information coming up. You have the cerebellum, fourth ventricle across it. This is your pneumotactic center. The pneumotactic center sits right here. And then just below that is the apneuistic center. Remember, the pneumotactic center, they didn't mark it. There we go. The pneumotactic center increases the depth of your breathing, makes your breathing deeper. The pneumotactic center decreases the depth of your breathing, makes it shallower. Okay. And again, here's the medulla oblongata as the superior portion of the brainstem. Okay. Here's a cadaver view of it. These are the different peduncles, the cerebellar peduncles we talked about. Cerebellum connects the cerebrum to the cerebellum to the cerebrum. You have the superior cerebral peduncles, middle cerebral peduncles, and inferior cerebral peduncles. And all these are nerve tracts that run through the medulla oblongata. Okay. Again, there's our picture of the brain. We've learned more structures here. Here's our frontal lobe, which we have talked about. This is the choroid plexus in the epithalamus. Choroid plexus has epididymal cells. Epididymal cells do what? Produce
blood, the CSF.
Perfect. They produce cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Then you have the thalamus, which is your egg-shaped nucleus right there. The pineal gland, which sits just behind the thalamus. You got your hypothalamus, which is just below the thalamus, which controls your pituitary glands, your hormones, things like that, your emotions. You have the aqueduct of the midbrain. The aqueduct of midbrain connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. You have your cerebellum, which is your cool points. And your fourth ventricle is between the cerebellum and the pons. Pons is the mass right there. Okay. All right. When you drink, how does it affect your brain? We've learned all these different centers. So what does it do now? So when you stagger or lose coordination from alcohol consumption, it's the effect on the cerebellum causing it. When you walk and you stumble, that's the effect that alcohol is having on the cerebellum. But my daughter says you're losing your cool points. You fall, you trip, and that's when you drink. There's an order which alcohol affects the brain. It has 5 different phases when you drink, what it does to your brain. First one, the first thing it does is alcohol affects the cerebral cortex. It depresses the behavior and inhibitory centers in the cerebral cortex. So you talk more. You're more confident when you talk. You're less socially inhibited. It slows down the processing of information from the senses. You don't feel things as quickly as you normally would when you're drinking. Okay, your afferent information does not get there as quickly. Everybody's known drunks that cuss their hands that don't even realize it. Okay, the information doesn't get up there as quickly. It inhibits the thought process, so there's clouded judgment. Everybody's familiar with all those stages of alcoholism, right? When someone drinks, you can easily see that as the first step. They talk more, they're more confident, less inhibited, they don't feel things, and their judgment is clouded. That's the first stage. Second stage is your limbic system, which we're going to talk about. You get exaggerated states of emotion and memory loss. You don't remember what the heck happened. You don't remember who you woke up next to or how you got there. Okay? You have exaggerated emotion. So your friends are getting drunker and drunker, and they'll sit there and start crying about all their things in their life to you. Okay? You get an exaggerated state of emotion. That's the second step. The third step is your cerebellum. That's the part we've been talking about. Movement becomes uncoordinated. You lose your balance. You fall off your bar stool. You have to grab something to stand up when you walk because you cannot walk a straight line. You cannot touch your fingers to the tip of your nose when the police pull you over. Okay? You're not able to do that. The cerebellum is affected. The fourth stage affects the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. This is the part that can cause trouble. It depresses your nervous system in the hypothalamus, so there's an increase in sexual behavior, and inhibits secretion from the pituitary, causing lack of absorption of water. It decreases aldosterone production, which is your antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so it increases your urine, and you go to the bathroom a lot when you hit the stage of being drunk. Okay, you have increased urine production because it inhibits the pituitary gland, and it increases sexual behavior. Notice that it says increases sexual behavior, not increases sexual performance. There's a big difference, a real big difference. You want to have sex, but you don't do as good at it. Okay, so it increases your sexual behavior, but not sexual performance. Okay, that's the fourth stage. The fifth stage, okay, is the medulla oblongata we talked about. That's your brainstem. That's when things get dangerous. Okay, it affects the reticular formation we talked about, which causes your comas, your awareness, your arousal. Okay, it affects reticular formation, causing sleepiness and unconsciousness. Okay, when alcohol reaches this level in the brain, that's when you get alcohol poisoning. That's when it can become fatal. That's when you go into a permanent coma. Okay? Your body is just not aware that it's still supposed to be alive, and it shuts down the reticular formation up there. Okay, so those are all the things we talked about and all the different layers of how alcohol effects occur in each of the different layers that goes through, and is that specific order where they occur. All right, the mesencephalon, the midbrain. Remember, the mesencephalon did not divide. The prosencephalon and the rhodencephalon did divide. The mesencephalon midbrain consists of two pairs of nuclei called the corpora quadrigemini. Quadrigemini means four. And it's the same we just talked about before, those four bumps. Two of them are the inferior colliculus, and two of them are the superior colliculus. They make up the corpora quadrigemini. They're responsible for your auditory and visual stimuli. Okay? Remember, the inferior colliculus is responsible for auditory processing or stimuli. The superior colliculus is responsible for visual processing. So the corpora quadrigemini are made up of the inferior colliculus and the superior colliculus. Each of those has two bumps, just below the cerebral cortex and above the cerebellar cortex. Okay, it consists of the nuclei of the reticular formation involving maintaining alertness. Okay, that's the part where the fifth level alcohol gets to you, where you don't maintain alertness anymore. And that's when it can become fatal. Okay, so the big thing, remember, when you see the corpora quadrigemini, you know, there's four bumps. Two of them are the inferior colliculus, which is auditory. Two are the superior colliculus, which is visual. Okay, so here's your mesencephalon, there's your midbrain, and here's your bumps. There's two right here, and there's two right here. Okay, that's your corpora quadrigemini. Quadra means four. The superior ones are your superior colliculi, visual. Your inferior ones are your inferior colliculi, auditory. Okay, the reticular formation will maintain your alertness going through the brainstem, through the midbrain. Here's your visual impulses coming in, and here's your auditory impulses coming in. Again, this affects the superior colliculi. This affects the inferior colliculi. Okay. The mesencephalon also consists of what's called a red nucleus, a substantia nigra, and the cerebral peduncles. The red nucleus is a relay center. It integrates information between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. The substantia nigra regulates motor output of the basal nuclei. Remember, the basal nuclei work with the cerebellum to coordinate movements and make everything less jerky. And the cerebral peduncles have ascending fibers that synapse in the thalamus and descending fibers on the cortical spinal pathway. Okay, this cortical spinal pathway connects the cortex of the cerebrum to the spinal cord. So your peduncles have ascending and descending fibers. The ones going up go to the thalamus. The ones going to get down go to the spinal cord. Okay. So here's your quadrigemini, your superior colliculi, and your inferior colliculi. Okay, there's your two bumps. There's two on each side. Okay, superior colliculi is visual. Inferior colliculi is auditory. The substantia nigra is a dark nucleus right here. The red nucleus, which collects your cerebrum and your cerebellum, okay, is located right here, and it's the red one. It's not really red in the body, but it is on the picture here. Okay, and then you have your reticular formation with the columns that provide the information that allow you to body to be alert, and your cerebral peduncles. Okay, again, connecting the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex. All right, we good so far? There's a lot of information in the brain here. The diencephalon. Diencephalon consists of your thalamus, hypothalamus, and your epithalamus. Those are your three parts. Okay, here's where they're located. Again, it's easy to find the thalamus. It's the egg shape right there. Above it is the epithalamus. Below it is the hypothalamus. Okay, the epithalamus. Okay, forms the roof of the third ventricle. That's where the epithalamus is. The posterior portion contains the pineal gland. Remember the pineal gland? The pineal gland produces a circadian rhythm. It produces melatonin. Okay, that regulates your day and your nighttime, tells you what's what. That's your pineal gland responsibility. The thalamus. Okay, the thalamus is below the epithalamus, and it's the egg-shaped nucleus that's right in the middle of the midbrain. That's easy to find when you dissect the brain. It forms the walls of the third ventricle. There's a right and a left thalamus. It is an egg-shaped nucleus. Okay. Each thalamus is divided into an anterior portion, a medial, a ventral, posterior, and lateral nuclei. Each section has a different control. The anterior part of the thalamus is a part of the limbic system, your emotions, your memory. The medial nuclei relay information to the frontal lobe, your thought process. The ventral portion relay information to the parietal lobes. The posterior goes to the occipital lobes, and the lateral goes to the cingulate gyrus. Okay, so each nuclei within the thalamus goes to a different section. That's why it's important when you're sending information to the thalamus, it goes to the right part of the thalamus for processing. Okay, so there's the thalamus. It sits right in the middle of the midbrain. You got your frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and this one here is your temporal lobe. Those are different lobes of the brain. Okay, there's the division of the thalamus, how they're divided up. You get input from the basal nuclei, you get input from the cerebellum, you get sensory input and visual and auditory. Again, from the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. Those are your inputs. Output goes up to the cerebral cortex, associated areas. This goes to the cingulate gyrus. This goes to the frontal lobe and fourth limbic system, the anterior section of it. So each group or each nuclei of the thalamus goes to a different area. The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is just below the thalamus. It forms the floor of the third ventricle. And it consists of numerous nuclei also. It has what's called an infundibulum. An infundibulum is a stalk. So here's your hypothalamus. Okay, it has a stalk that comes down off of it, and this is the pituitary gland. Okay, this is your pituitary gland. This is the infundibulum. Okay, so the infundibulum is a stalk of nerves, of neurons that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus also consists of mammillary bodies on the posterior wall of the hypothalamus. That's where you find your mammillary body. So here's your pituitary gland. And this is the infundibulum. This is the stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And on the posterior section of the hypothalamus, that's where you find your mammillary bodies. Okay? So the hypothalamus consists of nuclei, okay? And they control different areas. They control subconscious control of skeletal muscles. Okay? They control your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiration, digestive function. The hypothalamus basically is your homeostasis, how your body just maintains itself. The heart, your blood pressure, your breathing, and your digestion. That's all controlled subconsciously at the hypothalamus. It secretes antidiuretic hormone. Okay, remember the pituitary gland is inhibited by alcohol. So your antidiuretic hormone is not released when you start getting drunk. So you don't retain water, water goes through your body, and you urinate a lot. Okay, emotional behavior. Emotional and behavioral drives and thirst drives, hunger drives, okay, are all controlled through the hypothalamus. Coordination between voluntary and automatic functions are controlled. Body temperature, circadian rhythm, okay, are all controlled at the hypothalamus. Basically, is your body's thermostat. It controls how things are working. Okay, again, here's the infundibulum. It's this bundle of nerve fibers that travel from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, causing release of different hormones. And we'll go over, we haven't got to the pituitary gland yet. But the pituitary gland has a posterior lobe and an anterior lobe. And different hormones are released from different lobes. And the mammillary bodies are at the posterior portion of the hypothalamus. Here's your thalamus, and here's your hypothalamus. Cerebellum has two hemispheres. The folia cerebelli is a fold that goes between the right and left hemisphere of the cerebellum. Okay, they fold similar to the gyra and the cerebrum. They have anterior and posterior lobes. The vermis is what separates the hemispheres of the cerebellum. You have flocculonodular lobes. You have arbor vitae, and you have cerebellar peduncles, which is your stalk. Arbor vitae is strictly by Latin, means tree of life. It's all your branches that come up and branch through the cerebellum. That's your arbor vitae. That's what it's called. Basically, the tree of life. And there's your cerebellum right here. Here's where it's located. That's the cerebellum. Okay, here's the vermis. Okay, the vermis divides the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum. You have an anterior lobe. You have a posterior lobe, and you have the folia. So your anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and your folia. You know, left and right sides to the cerebellum. Okay, the I can't say that word anymore. Flocculonodular lobe. Man, flocculonodular lobe sits right here. And this is what divides that area of the cerebellum. Okay. This is the arbor vitae. You can see how it looks like branches of a tree. Okay. And it's called your arbor vitae. You have the superior cerebellar peduncle. You have the middle inferior cerebellar peduncle. And you have the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which are nerve tracts connecting the cerebellum. Okay, Purkinje cells. Purkinje cells are neurons found in the cerebellar cortex. Okay, there's lots and lots of dendrites. You can see the axons coming off here, coming off here, coming off here. But all these are dendrites. Hundreds and hundreds of dendrites. Okay, and they occur only in the cerebellar cortex. They're called Purkinje cells. And these dendrites project into the gray matter or the cell bodies of the cerebellum. Okay? You see the cell bodies of the Purkinje cells, and you can see the axons as they shoot down. But hundreds and hundreds of dendrites all over. Again, and Purkinje cells are only found in the cerebellar cortex. All right, the cerebellar cortex, again, where the Purkinje fibers are found, or subconscious coordination of movements. That's where everything goes smooth. Arbor vitae, okay, is your cerebellar cortex with your cerebellar peduncles. And those are your branches inside the cerebrum. The peduncles, you have a superior, a middle, and inferior. Your superior peduncle connects the cerebellum with the mesencephalon, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. The middle cerebellar peduncles communicate between the cerebellum and the pons. Your inferior cerebellar peduncles connect the cerebellum with the medulla oblongata. That's how the tracks run. Those are your cerebellar peduncles. The cerebrum, okay? Cerebrum is the main big part of the brain that does all your thinking. It consists of two hemispheres, front and back, right and left. It's got several lobes. It's got a frontal lobe, it's got a parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and a temporal lobe. And since you know all the bones, you know where those lobes are because they're right underneath each of the respective bones. You have gyri and you have sulci. Gyri are the bumps that stick up. Gyri are the grooves that go down. You have the longitudinal fissure, which is the main dividing fissure between the right and left hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. You have the corpus callosum, which is a connecting tract between the right and left hemispheres. Most of the hemispheres are not connected. They're connected through the corpus callosum. You have the basal nuclei, which coordinates with the cerebellum. And you have the limbic system. The limbic system is a really interesting system. That's our emotions and how everything is, how we inhibit things in society. Okay, so here's the brain. This is the right cerebral hemisphere, and this is the left cerebral hemisphere. This is the longitudinal fissure. This is that big dividing line between the right and left hemispheres. It's called the longitudinal fissure. This is the central sulcus. You can see it on both sides, kind of dividing right here. There's a central sulcus. You can see we got the longitudinal fissure, we got the central sulcus, we got the cerebrum, which you can just see in the very back here, and we got the parieto-occipital sulcus, which is the sulcus that divides the parietal and the occipital, which runs right through here. Okay. So when you look at the side of here, the cerebral hemisphere, we looked at the longitudinal fissure which ran across. Then you have the central sulcus, which is one of the main grooves in the brain that is identifiable. In front of that, you have a bump. That's the precentral gyrus. It comes in front of the central sulcus. Behind it, you have a bump. That's the postcentral gyrus. Okay. The difference between a fissure and a sulcus is fissures are deep, sulcuses are not quite so deep. There's no magical number. Is if it's fissure, it's real deep. If it's a sulcus, it's not as deep. Okay, so a fissure is basically a deep sulcus. Gyrus are your bumps going up. Sulci are your indentations going down. Okay, you got the parietal lobe here. You got the parietal occipital sulcus, separating the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. And you got your occipital lobe and your temporal lobe. Again, the corpus callosum is a connection between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. You have an anterior commissure that also connects, that forms a small connection between the two parts of the brain, two halves. Remember we talked about the caudate nucleus, which is this right here, a relay center, and the putamen, and the amygdaloid body. We'll get into those in just a second there. And the amygdaloid body is part of your limbic system. Here's the limbic system. This is the thalamus. Okay, your egg-shaped nucleus. Okay, the hypothalamus below that. This is the hippocampus and amygdala. These are parts of your limbic system. The thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. The hemispheres consist of gyri and sulci, bumps and grooves. The central sulcus, which you saw, the longitudinal fissure, which you saw, the cerebral lobes, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the frontal lobe, and the lateral sulcus on the side. Okay, so there's your longitudinal fissure, your central sulcus. Okay, again, see the central sulcus. These are your pre-central gyrus. These are your post-central gyrus. Okay. So again, here's your central groove, central sulcus, I'm sorry. The main sulcus dividing the brain. This is the lateral sulcus. Okay. And there's a parieto-occipital sulcus right back here too. But this is the parietal lobe. This is the frontal lobe. This is occipital lobe and your temporal lobe. Different lobes of the brain that correspond to the bones that we've already learned. Okay, your cerebral hemispheres. You have the frontal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal. The frontal lobe, conscious control of skeletal muscles. That's where you vote on things. That's where information comes to. It goes to the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe determines what's going to happen. That's what sends out the information, the neurons fired for the skeletal muscle contraction. That's where thinking occurs, your frontal lobe. Occipital lobe. Occipital lobe is perception of visual stimuli. That's your visual information sent to the lateral geniculate nucleus and sent to the back of the occipital lobe. The parietal lobe, conscious perception of touch, pressure, vibration, pain, temperature, and taste. All that goes to your parietal lobe. Temporal lobe, perception of auditory and smell stimuli. It's like we said before, that's where if you get hit in the head, if you get hit in the back of the head, you will see stars because that's your visual input. If you hit the side of the head, you'll hear bells because that's your auditory input there. So you really do see stars or hear bells depending on where you're hitting the head. Okay, so here's your parietal lobe, which you talked about, your occipital lobe in the back, frontal lobe in the front, and your temporal lobe is down below that. Okay, all corresponding to the skull bones that we already learned about. The insula is deep to the lateral sulcus, okay, in the mid part of the midbrain. It consists of olfactory cortex and gustatory cortex, taste. This is where you smell and taste, is in your insula. Okay? So the insula is responsible for smell and for taste. And this is where it's located, right in between the midbrain, lying deep to those tissues. It's called the gustatory cortex and the insula. Okay. We talked about the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. Those are the bumps in front of the central groove and behind the central groove. So the precentral gyrus is anterior to the central sulcus. And those neurons are directly involved with movement by controlling somatic motor neurons in the brainstem and spinal cord. The postcentral gyrus is posterior to the central gyrus. Okay. And those neurons receive somatic information for touch, pressure, pain, taste, temperature from the dorsal columns and spinal thalamic tracts. Okay. So far, so good. So this is your central sulcus. This is where it runs. And this bump here is your pre-central gyrus. This is your bump here is your post-central gyrus. Higher order functions performed by the cerebral cortex. That's where your higher order functions occur. They involve communication between the cerebral cortex and other areas of the brain. The frontal lobe is where all your higher order functions occur. They involve conscious and unconscious information processing. The functions are modifications, and what it comes to is the functions are subject to modifications and adjustments. We adjust it, especially at the cerebellum. We adjust things to make all the smooth movements. So things are always modified. You have integrated regions of the cerebral cortex. Those are centers that are various regions on your cerebral cortex that accomplish certain tasks. Certain integrate complex sensory stimuli and motor responses. You have various centers. You have a general interpretive area, you have a speech center, a prefrontal cortex, and Brodmann's areas. Okay? Those are different sections of the brain. This is where your frontal eye field focuses on the brain. This is your general interpretive area of things for the brain. This is where your speech center is located. And this is the prefrontal association cortex, where your thought process occurs. So different areas of the brain accommodate and perform different tasks. And it's the same on everybody. These are selected Brodmann areas of the cerebral cortex. He selected and numbered all these different areas that have different functions. Okay? Those are areas originally defined and numbered by the German anatomists Corby and Brodmann. They're based on cytoarchitectural organization of neurons. So he observed in the cerebral cortex which areas of brains were active and those he published. And he did this in 1909. 120, almost 110, 115 years ago. Okay? Many of Brodmann areas were based solely on neurological organization. He dissected the nerves, found out where they traveled to. And he made those lists of different areas. And it actually worked out that he was actually pretty close. So these are the Brodmann areas, and these are the different functions that they execute. Okay? And he did just by tracing the neurons of the body, different sections of the brain, was able to figure these out. And they actually are very close to what the brain actually does today. In all these different areas. And those are called Brodmann's areas. The integrated region of the cerebral cortex, you have that general interpretive area. Okay? It is found only in one hemisphere. Okay? Usually on the left, and it's your analytical center. Speech center is also called Broca's area. Okay, it's a motor center that regulates patterns of breathing and vocalization for speech. Prefrontal cortex, that is where learning and reasoning occurs. Okay, learning and reasoning, all your thought process, that is your frontal cortex. The prefrontal areas are up in front of that. Brodmann's areas in cortical function. Brodmann assigned numbers to various brain regions by analyzing each cellular structure. That's where the numbers came from. Okay? Perhaps the various cellular structures can correlate with specific functions. That's where you get them out. And a lot of those mappings were actually pretty true. The left hemisphere is responsible for speech. It's a speech center, writing, language, and mathematics. The right hemisphere is touch, spatial visualization. Some people are right brain, some people are left brain, some are more artistic. Spatial visualization takes a lot of practice. Okay? Right hemisphere people can do it a lot easier than left hemisphere people. Okay? So the input from your eye. Okay, this is your right hand. You look at this, your optic tract travels and it crosses over here. This is called the optic chiasm, cross. Okay, so the right eye goes to the left side of the brain. The left eye feeds information to the right side of the brain. Okay, the left side of the brain is your speech center, your writing. Left side of your brain is your analyst by touch, or your ability. And you got crossroad points. This is your corpus callosum where the brains cross over, where the fibers cross over from the right and left sides. Okay, the cerebrum also consists of bundles called association fibers, commissural fibers, and projection fibers. Association fibers. These fibers are tracks that interconnect areas of the neural cortex within the hemisphere. There's arcuate fibers and there's longitudinal fasciculi. That's how these associated fibers connect within the cerebral hemisphere. Commissural fibers are tracks that connect the two hemispheres. There's an anterior commissure and the corpus callosum. That's the main connection. And you also have the anterior commissure that connects the two hemispheres together. Okay, projection fibers track the link, or tracks that link the cerebrum with other regions of the brain and spinal cord. Those are projection fibers. So here's your arcuate fibers. These are these little smaller ones that branch out between different areas of the brain, and longitudinal fasciculi. These will travel long distances within the cerebral hemisphere. Okay? So not crossing out of the cerebral hemisphere. Again, looking at the top part of the brain here, this is the corpus callosum, which connects the right and left side, and this is the anterior commissure, which connects the right and left side of the brains also. These are projection fibers. See how they come down from the base down here up into the cerebral cortex and back. Those are projection fibers, your long fibers. Okay, the basal nuclei we talked about. The basal nuclei communicates with the cerebellum. Okay, these are masses of gray matter, cell bodies. Okay, embedded in white matter, which is your axons, inferior to the lateral ventricles. So just behind the lateral ventricles. Okay, they're involved with subconscious control and integration of skeletal muscle tone, how your muscles stay as the normal tone of your muscles. involved in coordination of learned movement patterns, and involved in processing, integration, and relay of information from the cerebral cortex once it's been thought about. Those are the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei, there's 5 of them. There's a caudate nucleus, there's the amygdaloid body, which is part of the limbic system. There's a colostrum, there's a putamen, and there's the globus pallidus. Okay, so here's your caudate nucleus. Okay, here's your putamen. Here's your globus pallidus. Here's the amygdaloid body. And here's the colostrum. Okay. Those are the 5 basal nuclei. Okay. So the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus control the cycles of arms and leg movements when you walk. That's what lets you coordinate your arm and leg movements. The colostrum plays a role in subconscious processing of visual information. And the amygdaloid body is part of your limbic system, which we'll talk about. The limbic system, that is your emotion. The limbic system is located between the cerebrum and the diencephalon, just above the corpus callosum. Your limbic system establishes emotional states. Okay, it links your conscious functions with the unconscious autonomic functions, and it facilitates memory storage and retrieval. Okay, so memory is linked to emotions through the limbic system. And if you think about it, when you get really upset and you're trying to argue with somebody and you're extremely upset because you can't understand their point of view and it's upsetting you, can you remember a lot of things you want to talk about? You don't, right? You have to settle down, relax, and then that memory will come back to you later on. Okay? So emotions are linked to memory storage and retrieval through the limbic system. The limbic system controls your emotional states. Okay? Your brain basically responds with anger. Okay? If you're driving on the freeway and someone cuts you off, you got to slam your brakes on. What's your first response? You say certain words, you threaten certain things. You initially have an anger response. That comes from evolution. Our initial response, we're violent to survive. Okay? The limbic system controls that. And then after a while, you settle down and you realize you're going to survive. You can keep driving your car. Okay? But that's your limbic system. Your limbic system controls and establishes your emotional state. Okay? And this is how the limbic system is made up. You can see the pineal gland back behind the thalamus. This is the thalamus right here. You have a cingulate gyrus, which is this right here. Okay. You have the thalamus, the hypothalamus. You have the hippocampus, which is this red area right here. And you have a fornix, which is this yellow area right in here, on top of that. And those are the parts of the limbic system. Okay. So it consists of a cingulate gyrus, dentate gyrus, parahippocampal gyrus, and the hippocampus. Okay, so those areas of the brain, those gyruses, those bumps, are what creates the limbic system. Okay, and here's what we have the detailed look at it. This is your thalamus. This is the anterior portion of the thalamus. That's the corpus callosum, where the right and left hemispheres connect. Okay, this is your cingulate gyrus. This whole function right here. That's your cingulate gyrus, all that green area. Okay. This is the parahippocampal gyrus on the edge down here. This is the hippocampus, the amygdaloid body, the hypothalamus nucleus, and the fornix. That extension right there. Okay. That's what makes up your limbic system. So the fornix, we just talked about, is a tract of white matter that connects the hippocampus with the hypothalamus. So fornix fibers extend to the mammillary bodies also. And the mammillary bodies, those control the reflex movements associated with eating. Okay, what happens when you eat? Your body reflexes, peristaltic motion, All your reflex movements associated with eating are controlled through the mammillary bodies that are behind the hypothalamus, closer to the hypothalamus. Okay, again, same picture again. That's your fornix. That's your cingulate gyrus. That's your hippocampus, hypothalamic nuclei. That's your thalamic nuclei. Mammillary bodies and the distal portion of it, and then the hippocampus. And then the parahippocampal gyrus down below. All right. See how much you still remember for that. Number 1 points to what? How about the cingulate gyrus? Okay. Number 2 connects the right and left hemispheres of the brain. What is it? Number 2 is the corpus callosum. Number 3, the yellow structure there that wraps around.
A fornix?
The fornix. That should be F-O-R-N. I can't see that's an M or R-N. It should be an R-N. Fornix. And that red body right there.
Mammillary body?
Your mammillary body. Perfect. And then that lower part of the cingulate gyrus. That is the... Yeah, you got it. Perfect. The parahippocampal gyrus, right?
Yeah.
Yep. Where did I go? Here we go. Whoa, went too far. Okay, then the hippocampus is the red mark there. Went farther. And number 7, what does that point to?
Amygdaloid?
The amygdaloid body. Okay, and number 8. We didn't talk about that one, but you know what it's not. So which one is it?
Olfactory?
Olfactory tract. And number 9 is the hypothalamic. Yep, hypothalamic nuclei. Perfect. Good. That's your limbic system right there. That's what makes up or compose the limbic system. There's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Okay? They innervate the peripheral, emerging from the brain. They do not originate from the spinal cord. They emerge from the brain. So the 12 cranial nerves do not travel through the spinal cord. They come right out of the brain. They're on the ventrolateral surface of the brain, and they're numbered from 1 through 12. Okay, and that's the list right there. There's the olfactory nerve is number 1, optic nerve is number 2, oculomotor is number 3, trochlear is number 4, trigeminal is number 5, abducens is 6, facial nerve is 7, vestibular-ocular nerve is 8, glossopharyngeal is 9, vagal nerve is 10, hypoglossal nerve is 12, and accessory nerve is 11. Oops. There we go. All right. So this is on the specimen, on the cadaver. You can see the optic nerve. See this cross right here? This is what he's talking about. This is the optic chiasm. That's where your optic nerves cross. And you can see that really well there. And again, it's a list of all the same nerves. And they come directly, don't go to the spinal cord. Okay. They run directly from the lateral ventral surface of the brain. And there's 12 and they exit on each side. Number 1. Olfactory nerve, smell. Okay, goes through olfactory foramen and it goes through olfactory bulbs. It's a sensory nerve only. Okay, it runs through the cribriform plate of the crista galli of the ethmoid bone. You have the optic bulb, transmits down the optic nerve. Okay, it is optic cranial number 2 is the optic nerve. Okay, it's also only sensory. Its function is vision. Goes through the optic canal, ends in the retina, and goes through the occipital lobe is where it focuses its image for interpretation of what it's seeing. And the right eye goes to the left side of the occipital lobe, left eye goes to the right part of the occipital lobe. And you see how it crosses over here, goes through the laterogeniculate nucleus, and then extends onto the back and the visual cortex of the occipital lobes. Number 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Okay? It controls extraocular eye movement, and it is motor function. There's no sensory function of this one. It controls your extraocular eye movement. It's in the mesencephalon, and it runs through the superior orbital fissure. Okay. You can see the fibers here. the inferior rectus muscle, and you see the superior rectus muscle. So it's your external eye movements. This is your oculomotor, number 3. Number 4 is a trochlear nerve. It's a motor nerve also. This is extraocular eye muscles also. And it's the foramen goes through the superior orbital fissure. Okay, you see what runs here. This is nerve number 4. Through the superior orbital fissure, comes up here and conforms to the eye. Goes through the superior oblique muscle of the eye. Moves the eye up. Trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal nerve is a mixed sensory and motor nerve. It's ophthalmic sensations from your forehead, your eyelids, and your nose, and sensation from your lower eyelids, your upper lip, and your cheek. And it's the nerve of the mantle that controls mastication. It's your trigeminal nerve. Okay, it's the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular nerves it branches into. So it goes up the eye, the maxilla, and the mandible. It runs through the ophthalmic supraorbital fissure. The maxilla runs through the foramen rotundum, and the mandibular runs through the foramen ovale. Okay, ophthalmic and maxilla goes to the pons for interpretation for sensory, and then mandibular goes to the mandibular muscles for mastication. That's the trigeminal, the 5th cranial nerve. Things here's a cliffhanger, and here's the branches. Okay, it branches the ophthalmic branch up towards the eye. It branches through the foramen rotundum to the maxillary branch, and then to the mandibular branch. Okay, that's your trigeminal nerve. The abducens nerve controls your eye movement, and it's only motor. Okay, it goes to the pons, it goes through the superior orbital fissure, innervates the lateral rectus eye muscle. Okay, so here's the lateral rectus eye muscle that's been reflected here, but it innervates to right here and pulls the eye laterally. Okay, the 7th is a facial nerve. It's sensory and motor. Okay, sensation for the face and taste, and motor controls the muscles of the face. So it's a mixed nerve. Okay, it's for your taste buds and motor control from the pons. And it has the frame runs through the internal acoustic meatus, what it runs through. Okay, and here's your facial nerve as it comes across. That's the 7th cranial nerve. And it has branches to the cervical branch, mandibular, buccal, zygomatic, and temporal. So it branches to the entire face, and it controls these facial muscles of expression right here. Number 7. Number 8 is the vestibulo-ocular nerve. It's balance and hearing. Okay. Vestibular and cochlear, we'll talk about that when we do chapter 18, I'm sorry, with your auditory balance and equilibrium. Runs through the internal acoustic meatus, it's like the 7th cranial nerve, and it goes to the pons. Okay. So here's your 8th cranial nerve running through here, and here's your 7th cranial nerve, both going through the external acoustic meatus. Okay. The 9th is the glossopharyngeal nerve. It's also a mixed nerve. Has the tongue pain and swallowing. Controls the sensory for the posterior of the back, 1/3 of the tongue, and it controls the salivary glands. Goes through the jugular foramen, and it's the sensory from the medulla oblongata. The visceral motor is a parotid salivary gland, and the pharyngeal muscles for swallowing are the somatic motor branch. And you can see where the 9th cranial nerve runs, glossopharyngeal, and innervates the tongue and the pharynx. The vagus nerve takes information from the organs, sensory for the organs, and the medulla oblongata. The jugular foramen, its autonomic centers for the medulla oblongata, muscles of the palate and pharynx, respiratory, cardiovascular, and digestive organs. This is the nerve that's extremely important for in the policeman's chokehold. This is the nerve they cut off. That's the nerve that makes you pass out. It controls your cardiovascular system. If you choke a person, you pinch off the vagus nerve, which is right here. You pinch it off, their heart will stop, and they will drop down and pass out. The heart will start back up again. So this is the nerve that's compressed during a chokehold. But you got to know what you're doing to use it. If you don't, you can kill somebody. The John Benet Ramsey case, which if you want me to lecture on that, I can get one of the labs, I can lecture on that. I've got all information on John Benet Ramsey case. This is what probably killed her, was compression of the vagus nerve. It's a real interesting case if we'll get a chance to go through. I've got all the, like I said, I've got all the stuff from Henry Lee that did the testification, that did the testifying for the court case in the battles with the John Benet Ramsey case. And it was the vagus nerve that caused a lot of that problem. And you can see where it runs. Go through the cardiac plexus, the digestive tract, and the respiratory system. It controls all that through the vagus nerve. Number 11 is the accessory nerve. It's a motor nerve, controls the sternocleidomastoid muscles, the trapezius, the palate, the pharynx, and the larynx. And it comes from the spinal cord and medulla oblongata. And again, it runs through the jugular foramen, has an internal branch through the palate, pharynx, and larynx, external branch to the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. Okay. And the last one is the hypoglossal nerve. It's only motor and controls your tongue. Runs through the hypoglossal canal, and its destination is the tongue muscles. Okay. There's a 12th cranial nerve. Okay. As it runs through, where am I at? Right here. And it innervates into the tongue. So the mnemonics, you want to remember how each one starts with one letter. It's once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. That's a way to memorize the 12 cranial nerves. And this is just a chart that goes through just as we said, all the different nerves. It just kind of sums up the sensory, the branches they branch out into, their primary function, the foramen they travel through, and what they innervate. And it just goes all 12 nerves, just so we cover it exactly. And remember, afferent neurons are sensory neurons that carry nerve impulses from sensory stimuli towards the central nervous system and brain. Efferent neurons are motor neurons that carry neural impulses away from the central nervous system towards muscles and cause movement.